I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Hi, this is Steve.
Hello, this is Cara.
And we'd like to welcome you to the Innkeepers podcast.
Yes, today we are really excited. We get the opportunity to interview Dr. Carmen Joy Imes. She is an associate professor of Old Testament at Biola University, my alma mater, and she completed her PhD work at Wheaton College. She then did, previously to that, she did her MABS at Gordon-Conwell Seminary and her BA at Multnomah University. Carmen has taught at Prairie College in Alberta, Canada. She and her husband were missionaries with SIM for 15 years, and they served doing church planting work in the Philippines, and then later on did some administration for a multi-country ministry called Sports Friends. Carmen is the author of Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, and that's the book that we will be talking about in this podcast. Mm-hmm. She is also the editor of Praying the Psalms with Augustine and Friends. She's passionate about equipping Christians to read the Old Testament well and embrace their identity and vocation as people who bear God's name.
Yeah, and I really believe in our conversation today, it's going to be really clear how understanding, a clear understanding of God and His calling on our life is so critical as we minister cross-culturally.
Hope you enjoy.
Well, Cara, today we have a great opportunity and privilege to interview Dr. Carmen Imes, and Carmen is an associate professor of Old Testament at Biola University. And so we'd like to welcome her to the podcast and ask her to introduce herself to our listeners a little bit.
Right. Well, thank you, Steve and Cara, for having me on the show. I am delighted to talk with your listeners. I have a real heart for missions, so it's a great connection. I am married to Daniel. We've been married for 23 years. We have 3 kids, and my husband and I met while students at Multnomah Bible College, now Multnomah University, where we both did our undergraduate degrees in Bible and theology. And then I did a master's degree at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary in biblical studies. And from there, we went to Wheaton College, where I did a PhD. But we spent a few years as missionaries in the middle between Multnomah and Gordon-Conwell. We were in the Philippines for a while. So we have a big heart for missions. Before coming to Biola, I taught at Prairie College in Alberta, Canada. Lots of people with missions connections know Prairie people. It's had a tremendous impact on the world. So excited to be part of the conversation today.
Thank you again.
I'm so glad that you're here with us. And can you share a little bit more about your missions experience and what that was like?
Sure. So my husband and I, when we were in college, felt a call to missions. Like we knew that's what we wanted to pursue. And so immediately after graduating from Multnomah, we did a short stint in church ministry. My husband was on staff at a church in Oregon while we raised support to go overseas. And we went with SIM, mm-hmm. which is an interdenominational church planting mission, to the Philippines. And we didn't feel called to a particular place, but we wanted to work with unreached people. And this was the placement that worked out. So we lived in Quezon City, part of Metro Manila, and we were reaching out to unreached people who lived in a neighborhood near us. Most of our time there was spent in language school and in beginning to do outreach in this minority community. We weren't there long enough to see a church planted. We imagined being there our entire adult lives, but we were only there 2.5 years, as things sometimes go in missions. Yeah. And long enough to see God really transform our view of ourselves and of Him and of ministry, and to give us so many cultural insights. I was just saying to someone yesterday I think I use an illustration from our time in the Philippines in the classroom probably at least every week, where I'm teaching something from the Old Testament and I have a Philippines illustration come to mind. So God has not wasted those years in terms of my own learning and development, but it wasn't quite what we expected.
Yeah, that is often the case in missions. We go with big plans and we never know how God is going to use that.
Yeah. So ultimately, we were with SIM for 15 years. We ended up coming back from the Philippines to work out of SIM's main office. My husband was the administrator for a ministry called Sports Friends, which it's a multi-country ministry of SIM, and he managed finances and logistics for them while I went through seminary and grad school. So we continue to serve with SIM, just not in the capacity that we initially imagined.
Our family was 5 years in Eastern Europe, and it was it was life-changing for all of us, and it was great. So we're going to make reference today to a book you wrote called Bearing God's Name, and we're going to refer to the book several times. And it was kind of reading through that book that really started me thinking about understanding God and missions and the life of the missionary. In fact, you quote a gentleman, Duncan Westwood, and it says this, the quote is, "The strong correlation between the picture one holds of God and one's resilience in the face of difficulty." So just kind of like our view of God and how we face difficulty. Can you just talk a little bit about that and why that's significant?
Yeah, this concept that I got from him was really profound. Unfortunately, he hasn't published it. I heard it like from a workshop and then tracked him down to sort of confirm from him. I wish I could tell you a book to go by that goes into this in more depth. But his idea is that what comes to mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And it's the biggest predictor of our resilience in the face of difficulty. And so many of us walk around with underdeveloped pictures of who God is that haven't matured with us to adulthood. And so we're still imagining him scowling at us as a taskmaster or a disciplinarian or whatever. And Westwood says that we need to develop a full-orbed picture of God that includes intimacy and growth through the various stages of our lives, and a capacity to embrace mystery. And that if we can wrap our minds around God, we haven't fully understood him, because we're human and finite, and there's always more of God than what we can wrap our minds around. So he encourages us to press into that, and that will equip us to better handle stresses in our lives. I found that really profound.
It's almost as if we are willing to accept that God is mysterious and beyond our knowing and understanding, then the things that happen in our life that are also mysterious and beyond our understanding, we can entrust to a God that is beyond our understanding.
Yes, totally. And this definitely came into play for us in missions. Just our view of who we were and who God was so neatly packaged before we went overseas. I think my thought was, we've both been through some of the best Bible training in the world. We had 4-year degrees from Multnomah, and we were ready to take what we knew and share it with people who needed it. And I found in Manila that I came face to face with all sorts of people who didn't care about what I knew. Mm-hmm. And I was very well equipped to teach inductive Bible study methods. And these were primary oral learners. And I couldn't get out a pack of colored pencils and the text and teach them how to mark it up, because they didn't have a pencil in their entire house, multi-family dwelling. Like, they don't have pencils and they don't have books. That's not how they think. And I just realized that my training hadn't prepared me for what these people needed. And I felt it was a very humbling experience. I felt very impoverished, like I had nothing to offer. And what I noticed about myself is I was really grumpy and frustrated and depressed and struggling. And who am I to try to help these people when what's going on in my soul is so ugly? And so it really drove us to prayer and drove us to re-examine who are we and who is God and why has he called us here.
Yeah, I think when you have the opportunity to live cross-culturally, probably the thing you learn the most is who you are and how you view God, because it's so revealing of our heart attitude, and especially when in a hard circumstance. So let's just kind of imagine a missionary family that suffered a really tough circumstance. And I don't know, we don't have to make something up, because we all know it could be an illness or a death or something. So just walk us through their view of God, if it's like underdeveloped or incomplete, and how they could look at it in one way, or maybe a more healthy way of looking at the same situation.
Yeah, I think one of the areas that I have often seen people imagine God, this, depending on your denomination, it depends on how you think about God's sovereignty. But some who have kind of a really neat and tidy view of God is sovereign, he causes all things. And now we're in the midst of a pandemic and our children are not allowed to leave the house and they can't go to school and we're stuck at home. We have friends in the Philippines whose children were literally housebound for over a year and have not been in the classroom for 2 years now. And just tremendous strain on the whole family to not have that outlet and to not have relationships. If in that situation you have a view that God causes everything, then you have to go back to then everything you're experiencing that's negative, God did to you. So then there's this effort to try to figure out, why is God doing this? What is God's purpose in this? I think a healthier view of God is to recognize that God created the world and he is all powerful, but that he's relinquished some of that power to humans. And sometimes we make choices that are not great. Yeah. And so that sometimes what we're experiencing is not, this is what God designed, but this is what he allowed by virtue of allowing human freedom. And so we have human leaders who are making decisions about how to respond to the pandemic that may be wise or unwise, and we have to live with the consequences of that. And it's so we're not attributing it to God as causing this, but like this is just part of living in a broken, fallen world where humans work out their own issues in ways that are more or less helpful to human flourishing. So that's one way. I think if we saw God instead of like having an intricate plan that's all mapped out and doesn't take human freedom into account, if we see that God is a God who's promised to walk with us through difficulty, and that he's not derailed by human sin or human choices or human foolishness, but that he then walks with us through that and helps to develop character through it. I don't know. I think that can be freeing. I just saw a testimony actually of one of these kids who's now gone on to college and just spent his entire senior year in lockdown, not seeing any friends, not playing any sports, not going to any movies, just like kind of a loss. And he's now in college, and his testimony is that he was really struggling at first, and then God met him in that place of difficulty, and he realized that God had gifts. These are my words, not his. This is something I've often said, that God has gifts to give us that can only come wrapped in suffering. And that there's it's not that God's causing the suffering or that he designed the suffering, but that we are going to actually discover more of God when we're in suffering than we could otherwise. And I think this was my experience in the Philippines during our 2.5 years there. It was a time of great spiritual dryness for both me and my husband. God felt silent and distant, and we had sold everything and left everybody, and we're in the midst of culture shock and adjusting to climates, a different climate and pollution and language and just all the cultural adjustment. It was so hard. And yet we didn't feel like we were accomplishing what we came to do. So it was really demoralizing. And we had so many questions about, why would God bring us here? What is this even for? And looking back, I can see how our hunger to experience God in the midst of that was actually a gift. Like the hunger was a gift. This sense of longing for God was something we had never experienced or needed to experience before. And we came to treasure the presence of God in a way that we didn't before that. And so he had gifts for us in it. It wasn't fun to go through. But I think that's shaped how I've gone through subsequent periods of suffering, because I know, like, even when God feels utterly absent, he's beside us. We can't feel him or see him, but he's actually doing his work deeply in us in ways that we can't see. Like you hear the illustration about a tree. Like if a tree is in a rainforest where there's lots of water all the time, the roots don't go very deep. And so a wind could blow it over really quickly. But a tree in a place that experiences drought has really, really deep roots. And I feel like that's what I've experienced. That was one of God's gifts to me through our time in the Philippines, was that sense of dryness and not even hearing from God made us just really put down deep roots, thirsting for God. And then when we went through trials later, it's like, we've been through this before. You can't blow us over with this. Like we know there's hope on the other side. And we also learned that this kind of suffering is just part of the Christian life, that this feeling of God's absence is actually normal part of the Christian life. And I don't know that anyone had told us that before. So that's part of how our view of God shifted in those years.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. You mentioned also in your book about liminal spaces and how God uses those times. I think you've given a bit of a description of that right now, but can you elaborate on what a definition of liminal spaces is and how that kind of plays out?
Sure. I can remember when I learned the word, I was in seminary, and I feel like I came across it about 5 times and had to look it up 5 times or more before it actually stuck. But now that it's stuck, I feel like it's such a helpful concept. So it comes from the Latin word limen, which means threshold. And the basic concept of liminality is like being in between places. So like if you're standing on the threshold of a building, like in the entry door, you're not inside and you're not outside. You're just right there on that boundary line, either in or out. And all around the world, different cultures have rituals like coming of age rituals, marriage rituals, setting someone apart for spiritual ministry, spiritual role in the community. And every ritual all around the world includes an element of liminality. So it's something sociologists have talked about for a long time and anthropologists, to talk about these seasons of transforming someone from one role to another. They go through a period of liminality. So, in a coming of age ritual, maybe the young man is sent off into the woods to fend for himself for 2 weeks and then comes back. He leaves a boy and he comes back a man, right? And that 2-week period is liminal space. He's not part of the community. He's off on his own and he's being remade. And so that concept is not only in the Bible, but we experience it in so many ways. So in my book, I talk about how Israel goes through liminal space when God takes them out of Egypt. He could have just put them on the express train and gotten them right into Canaan. I mean, it's like an 11-day journey, and they could have been done. But he brings them to Mount Sinai in the wilderness, which is liminal space. They're away from their home culture, like the place they've been living for generations. They no longer have their homes, their work, their social structures. Everything's upended in the desert. They're living on the move, carrying everything they have, but they're not in a place where they can be settled yet. And so that in between space it so often can feel to us like a waste. Like, why didn't God do it faster? But I believe that God had work to do in his people that could only be done in a state of dislocation, in that liminal space. And they're not ready for Canaan yet. They need to be reshaped and reformed.
So when we think about cross-cultural workers, that idea of liminal space really struck me, because you're not in your home culture and you're really not, you're there in another culture, but you're not part,
it takes a long time.
Yeah, it takes so long to really feel like you are accepted in there.
Mm-hmm.
So can you just kind of maybe describe some of the feelings a cross-cultural worker might go through as they kind of transition? Like, I left, and sometimes it comes out as, God, I left everything for this. And these people, I mean, you mentioned this, people don't know me, they don't understand, they don't care, but this is what you've called me to. Mm-hmm. So kind of, can you just talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I have not met anyone who likes liminal space. Yeah. And yet missionaries are really volunteering to experience dislocation and to go to a place where they're not going to be known, they're not going to understand what's going on around them. And all of the support structures and the routines that we find comfort in, and the ways that we sort of recharge or replenish our energy, like all of those are different. Nothing's the same. And so it can be profoundly disorienting. And I think, missionaries are usually are people who are feeling spiritually strong and close to God. And that's why people put their money behind this and say, yes, I want to send you to do this ministry. So then it feels very surprising when you get to this new place and you're kind of an emotional wreck.
Yes.
Like all of the ways you've learned to cope and thrive in your home environment have to all be rediscovered. And I really believe that in that process, it deepens our connection with God and our understanding. I think, Steve, you mentioned earlier that our identity gets remade when we experience life in another culture. And so God does really important work, but it's messy and it's long. And not to mention, say you really land and you really invest in the culture, you learn the language and you now have a community and you're thriving. Missionaries don't stay there forever. They come home for home assignment. And so there's this sort of regular experience of dislocation for missionaries and their kids then who then don't belong.
I wrote a prayer letter one time called Home Again, because when you're away from home, all you dream and imagine about all the things that you're not experiencing. And then you go back to quote unquote home or home assignment. And then you think about all the things you just left behind in your country of service and how you miss those things. And it's like, we can be very fickle as humans, but
it's hard stuff. Cara, you were going to say something.
I just, as I listened to you describe that and the reality that cross-cultural workers live in liminal spaces, I think more often than most. I would say refugees and some others who have very transitory lives also would experience this. But I feel like there's a choice that has to be made. Will I run to God in the midst of this discomfort? Or will I run to something else?
And there are so many new ways to run to something else that weren't even available 20 years ago when I guess we went overseas 19 years ago, and we didn't have social media. We couldn't just live vicariously through other people's lives. There were blogs. I remember using instant messenger to chat with a friend kind of on a regular basis. We would connect, texting to each other through instant messenger. But I think now we have all these ways of not being physically present where we live, of just sort of living in this digital universe. And I wonder what that looks like now for cross-cultural missions. Like how much harder is it to plant and really integrate in a new culture when you can keep escaping to your own home culture?
Yeah. And I think it's just helpful, as you're talking about this liminality, for us to understand that this isn't wasted. God can use this to be deepening our relationship with him when we feel so disoriented.
Yeah.
And I think so often those first 2 years of learning a language or a culture, probably 3, 4, 5 years before you really feel like, okay, I've got this.
Yeah.
Some don't even have the opportunity to make it that long. And if they're so distracted in a digital world, or their feelings of incompetence lead to, well, then I really wasn't called for this, or all those questions, forgetting that God is doing something in them.
Yeah.
I often say to our guests here, I do debriefings with them, and I say, God is doing something in you just as much as he's doing something through you. Mm-hmm. It's not just, he didn't call you to missions just for you to do things for him. Yeah. He's going to transform you.
Yeah. And I feel like I should hasten to put an addendum on what I said a moment ago about social media, because I'm also thinking of what a gift it is, right. That missionaries can stay connected with family and friends back home. And maybe that can actually refuel them in a way that they can stay engaged in their host culture. So what my comment was not intended at all to heap shame on people who are engaging in social media. Right. If I was still in the Philippines, I'd be staying connected, but there are new dangers. They told us in language school, they encouraged us not to stock up on groceries, but to only buy enough food for one day, so that every day we'd have to go back out to the market and buy some more and engage with people, because otherwise you can just sort of hole up in your house and
it's easy to do. It's there were times, and we had a car when we lived overseas, and not everyone has that privilege or opportunity, and so we could do extra things. I was thinking about Abraham. I mean, Abraham basically, once he left, with his family and with his father and so on, I mean, he lived the rest of his life in a liminal space, because he was never settled in the land that was promised. Yeah. And he never was back in his home country, he lived in that space the rest of his life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this applies, if you think about it, it applies in so many different ways. And it's a helpful vocabulary, I think, for us especially for cultures, workers.
Oh, I know. And I feel, and I've said it before too, that when someone is in a new culture, you really need to give yourself the grace to experience life without, for whatever reason, it's like, I don't know why I thought I should expect to know or understand the next thing that was going to happen when I was living in a place I had never lived in before. Yeah. And I mentioned this at a seminar we did recently where, we didn't know Christmas was 5 days long. We didn't know Easter was 5 days long, and if you don't get to the store before the holiday, you might not get what you're looking for because the store's shut down. And the stuff that you don't know, and you don't know that you don't know it anyway. Just giving yourself grace to live in a place like that. Well, I know that, speaking of liminal spaces, one of the things that jumped to my mind was the idea of TCKs, third culture kids. Yeah. Who they aren't living in their parents' home culture, and they're living in the culture where their parents are serving it cross-culturally. And they can really struggle with not being in one place, not being a citizen of one place, not being a citizen of another place. And this really has kind of identified the life of a TCK. Have you had any interaction or any conversation with missionary kids, or any thoughts about this?
Yeah, so we had one daughter who was already born when we moved to the Philippines. She was quite young, and she at that age, loved transition, thrived with it, did really well. So re-entry wasn't hard for her when we came back to the States. But then we had two more kids who struggle more with change. And although we're not overseas anymore, in 23 years of marriage, we've moved 15 times. And so we've been kind of in this, you said, Cara, that it takes 3 to 5 years to get really established. I wouldn't know, because we've typically moved like every 3 years. So we've found ourselves often in extended periods of liminal space. One thing, we went through a debriefing in Colorado Springs after we came back, and one of the tools that they taught us that we've continued to use is we take a big piece of poster board and draw a transition bridge. Yes. And on one end of the bridge, we put we use teardrops and balloons. So like teardrops, for inside each teardrop, we write something we're sad to be leaving behind when we moved. And then balloons for things we're celebrating that we're going to. And it's been it's been really a helpful way for our kids to kind of conceptualize and process the move. So our 13-year-old, before we came to Southern California last summer, he was like, "Are we going to do our bridge?" Like, he was really into it.
Yeah.
Because he just recognizes that it's important to process. And so for us to give him space to be sad about what he's leaving behind and not to feel threatened by that, like, no, we need you to be happy. That's been good for us. I think the challenge, as you identified it, for TCKs is never feeling like they fully belong, either in their parents' culture or their home culture. And so giving spaces for TCKs to talk about their experiences. I was talking with one last week. We have quite a number of TCKs at Biola. And I was talking with one last week who visited Eastern Europe over Christmas, which is where she grew up. And she spoke Polish again for the first time in years. And she grew up going to Polish schools. And she said, "I feel like I reconnected with a part of myself that had been lying dormant for years." And like, she like refound a part of herself. So just creating spaces for TCKs to talk about their lives, to talk about what they love, what they miss, I think is important in helping them transition. And I think the goal would then be to help them find their identity in Christ, that we can find a home in Christ, even though we're never fully at home in a culture.
Yeah. You just nailed on what I was going to say. So I myself am a missionary kid, and that experience of having lived practically 15 years of my life in Brazil and then transitioning as a young adult and going to Biola University, and that whole pretty hard season of my life, I truly discovered that God was my home. And so that moment of that season wasn't just a moment, that season of liminality in my life forced me to ask some hard questions. And I had the choice of, do I run to God or do I run away? And it was transformative. And I think it redirected the course of my life in some significant ways.
That's so beautiful. Yeah. I do a lot of work in Exodus. My book, Bearing God's Name, takes place, kind of is rooted in Exodus, but I'm working on a commentary on Exodus. And so I've written the first 5 chapters. And so I've spent a lot of time in these early chapters of Moses' life. And Moses is a TCK. Like, he is, he's born Hebrew, adopted by Egyptian royalty. So he has not just the cultural and language change, but the socioeconomic huge disparity. And then you see him kind of in the first few chapters of Exodus, you can see him kind of wrestling with his identity, and you can see other people not sure how to categorize him. So is he a Hebrew or is he an Egyptian? In chapter 2, it says he goes out to where his own people were and watched them at their labor. And you kind of wonder, like, did he know they were his own people? How did he know? Who told him this? And he kills the Egyptian, which means he's identifying with the Hebrews. But the next day when he comes and sees Hebrews fighting, they don't accept him. Who made you ruler and judge over us? So then he finds out, oh, my deed became known. So he flees to Midian and meets Zipporah and her sisters, and they go home and tell Dad, an Egyptian rescued us. So they don't see him as a Hebrew, they see him as an Egyptian. So something about his appearance, or he apparently didn't identify himself or his ethnicity. And that's typical in, there's these type scenes in the Old Testament where patriarch meets his wife at a well. And in this type scene, the patriarch is supposed to identify his origin, and Moses doesn't, like, in contrast to the other type scenes, he doesn't, which highlights this sense of his own ambiguity or his hybrid identity. And what I really love is in chapter 3, when Moses meets God in the burning bush and God speaks to him, he encounters God again in kind of this question state, like, we don't know who he is. His wife gives birth to a son, and Moses names him Gershom, which means foreigner there, saying, I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. And I'm like, do you mean you're a foreigner now in Midian? Or do you mean that when you were in Egypt, you became a foreigner? You know, like, did you have a moment of realizing I don't really belong in the palace? You know, you became a foreigner. So he's so much thinking about his own lack of clear identity that he names his son after it.
Yeah.
And then when he encounters God, the first thing God says to him in verse 6, you know, he calls him by name, Moses, Moses. And then he says, don't come any closer, take off your sandals. And then he says, I am the God of your father. And I love this because everywhere else it's, I'm the God of your fathers, or the God of your fathers, plural.
Yeah.
But it's singular here. And if I'm Moses, I'm wondering, yeah, could we talk about that a minute? Because what do you mean?
Yeah.
Which father are you the God of? And then he clarifies the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And so in one fell swoop, Yahweh has identified himself and he's identified Moses.
Yeah.
Like both of their identities, it's like when you go to the eye doctor and they're like turning the lenses until you can see clearly. It's like in this one interaction, God turns both lenses, and in the same moment, he can see who he is in light of who God is. And that, I think that's actually how it works for all of us. We can't truly know our own identity aside from knowing God's identity and our relationship with him. And so for TCKs, I feel like it works this way too, right? You discover who you are as you discover who God is to you, and you find your home in him. Like, I don't belong anywhere, but I do belong to you.
Yeah.
I'm yours.
Yeah. That's so important. And I think anytime any of us are in a situation where we're tempted to kind of doubt God, or I think if we press in and seek him and seek his goodness and his character and to know him better, he just draws us in and he confirms who he is and he confirms who we are, because we really don't understand or can't understand who we are without understanding who God is. So that's great. And that's a great insight there. I hope that there's opportunity. Maybe we'll get a chance to teach that someday, a TCK seminar or something.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So in the book, Bearing God's Name, of course, something that it's has a lot of time, you spend a lot of time on the 10 words or the 10 commandments, as we are popularly known. So, but the whole idea of rightly bearing the name of God, which is your translation of what we typically refer to as not taking the name of the Lord's name in vain.
Yes.
Just talk about that a little bit, and how a missionary or ministry, Christian in ministry, kind of, the opportunity we have to rightly bear God's name.
Yeah, I came into PhD studies after having spent time in missions, and I think I would have loved to become a missions professor, but you can't really do that with only 2 years of field experience. And so when it came time to decide what to study, I picked Old Testament, but I was coming to it with kind of a missional framework. And my advisor at Wheaton, Dan Block, helped me land on this particular topic. What I studied for my dissertation was the command not to take the Lord's name in vain. So I spent 5 years unpacking that verse from every possible angle, culturally, historically. Are there parallel passages? How do we analyze each and every word, and think about how metaphors function, and just from every possible angle. And I am deeply convinced that we've gotten this command wrong, that we think of it as a prohibition of either saying God's name or using it as a swear word or using it in oaths, but all like speech related. And I really truly believe that the context makes the most sense of a reading that's more missional. The idea is that when Israel gets through the wilderness and arrives at Sinai, that God is claiming them as his own. Yahweh is saying, you are mine, you belong to me. And in Exodus 19, he calls them his treasured possession, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. So he's claiming them as his own and commissioning them to represent him among the nations. And so their vocation is to bear God's name. And so the command, the way I read it, is asking them not to bear Yahweh's name in vain, not to misrepresent him among the nations. And that would be like claiming you're part of the people of Yahweh, you're a covenant member, you're circumcising your sons and you're celebrating the Passover, but you're living like, in terms of ethics, there's no difference between you and the Canaanites or the Philistines or the Edomites. Nobody can tell the difference. And so for me, that's what's going on with the law at Sinai. God's not giving them laws to beat them down or to show them their miserable failures or to give them a path to earn their salvation. He's already saved them. And what's happening at Sinai is God saying, okay, I'm commissioning you to represent me among the nations. Here's how you need to live so that people will truly know what I'm like. Mm-hmm. You're my representatives. So people can't see me, but they can see you. And you're going to point to me. And that's obviously exactly what missionaries are doing. It's what every believer is called to do, to represent God in every sphere of our lives. So, but especially for those working cross-culturally, you are carrying forth the message of Jesus, but you don't just, it's not like you can take the message apart from your own self or apart from your own body. You are the message. You embody the message. The way that you live is what people are looking at. It would do nobody any good if you said, in whatever cultural context you are, this is what God is like, and then you turn around and beat your children and beat your, beat your wife or stole from your neighbor. Like, the message and the person go together. So we are the message. We embody what God wants the nations to see and hear.
That's good.
That is missions. I mean, when I was reading your book here recently in preparation for our podcast today, I was just struck by how really Israel was being prepared to be missionaries in the desert.
Yeah. And it's of course different in the Old Testament than it is now. So before Acts chapter 1 and 2, it's a come and see approach rather than a go and tell, right? There is a difference. God doesn't send them from Sinai to, 2 by 2 to take the message.
Yeah.
They're more like a city on a hill. And the idea is that the nations will be drawn to it. But then Jesus turns around and sends his disciples out once they have the Spirit to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So there's a pivot in the book of Acts that affects what bearing God's name actually looks like in practice. But it's the same vocation.
Yeah, right. And I think it goes right back to our earlier discussion, is you really have to know who God is before you can rightly bear his name to the world around us. And you have to understand who God is, understand who you are before God. And because then you're equipped to rightly bear his name.
Yeah. And I think to connect back to what we said earlier, we don't find out who we are by going to a retreat center and sitting in a room and introspecting, right? Like, we don't find out who we are by a process of self-discovery apart from God. We find out who we are in the presence of God. He tells us who we are. It's not like, let's see, who do I want to be? I'm going to choose these attributes or choose these whatever descriptors. And it feels like we live in a time in which everyone is being encouraged to create their own identity. And it can shift on a regular basis. How are you now identifying? And yet, if we believe that our true identity is rooted in who God says we are, then we can only find it in his presence. And so we encounter God at the retreat center, and he can help tell us who we are. And then our vocation flows out of that.
So is there anything else you want to be sure to mention today? I've really appreciated, enjoyed our conversation, and so many different ways we could go with this, but we have to honor everyone's time here. So
I think I just would want to leave people with a thank you for your willingness to leave the comforts of home and bear God's name in other places, to willingly enter liminal space and represent God. I think that's just a tremendous gift and service to the church. And to all of you who are listening, who are in support positions for those people, I hope this conversation has given you a taste of what some of the challenges might be that people are facing, and how you might, I hope it's sparked ideas for how you might come alongside and encourage those who are serving overseas or serving cross-culturally.
Thank you. Those are good thoughts.
Thank you so much. This is just good material that'll help us all grow, I think, in our walk with God. Cool. Thanks for writing the book, and we will recommend it to lots of people.
Yeah, well, thank you for your work to encourage missionaries. It's such a needed ministry.
Yeah, thank you again.
All right.
Well, Cara, comment a little bit about the interview today. What's something that struck you?
Yeah, I just really loved how Carmen was able to look and see how Moses was a TCK and just explain just from the text really how you could see Moses struggling with his identity and all that. I just found like that is just so profound when we are, as TCKs, can identify in Scripture. There are other TCKs and how their identity gets defined. And she made it so clear that God is the one that defines our identity. And that's just such a good reminder.
Yeah, he met Moses in the desert, and he, just in that brief encounter, how she talked about how God told Moses who he was as God and who Moses was as his servant. Yeah,
it's powerful. How about you, Steve? What are you thinking?
Well, a couple of things, really. I just like the idea when she was talking about understanding, truly having a good understanding of who God is as we face difficult situations, and that can help us be more resilient. I think I really enjoyed that, because a right view of God really helps us minister from a right place.
Yes.
And then just the concept of the liminal spaces. When I read the book, immediately one of the first things I thought of as I read about liminal spaces was about missionaries and missionary kids, and how they're not living one place and they're not living another place. And anyway,
what you do with that reality of liminal space being a life. I think it's just so powerful that God uses those moments, those seasons.
Yeah, and it can be very disruptive in your life. But I think God allows that so that you will turn and seek him and seek your security and stability in him, and not in your home culture, not in your daily routines, and all those kinds of things, because those can be real sources of security.
Yeah, this world is not our home.
This world is not our home. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Dr. Imes, and if you have opportunity to get a hold of her book, Bearing God's Name, I think you'll really enjoy reading it.
Yep. Well, we thank you for listening, and we hope that you join us next time
on The Innkeepers. Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.